And Jason Williams when reckless behavior turned fatal. Let's start with the most shocking fall from grace in NBA history. Jason Williams, whose reckless behavior with a shotgun ended a man's life and destroyed everything he'd built. Williams was a beloved NBA player, known for his rebounding prowess and charismatic personality, but his story became a cautionary tale about how quickly success can turn into tragedy when you make catastrophically poor decisions. On February 14, 2002, Williams was showing off his gun collection to friends at his New Jersey mansion when he grabbed a 12-gauge shotgun that he believed was unloaded. While joking around and demonstrating the weapon, Williams accidentally discharged the gun, killing his limousine driver, Kostas Christofi, instantly. What happened next turned an already tragic accident into a criminal conspiracy that would send Williams to prison for years. Instead of immediately calling 911 and taking responsibility, Williams and his friends attempted to cover up what happened. They wiped down the gun, placed it in Christofi's hands, and tried to stage the scene to look like a suicide. This cover-up attempt transformed what might have been a manslaughter case into charges including aggravated assault, conspiracy, and witness tampering. The legal proceedings dragged on for years, with Williams initially avoiding the most serious charges but eventually pleading guilty to aggravated assault in 2010. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, serving 27 months before being released. But the real punishment was watching his entire legacy crumble. His broadcasting career ended, his reputation was destroyed, and he became known more for killing someone than for his basketball achievements. Williams' story illustrates how a single moment of poor judgment can destroy decades of success. He wasn't a criminal mastermind or a repeat offender. He was a successful athlete who made a series of catastrophically bad decisions that cost someone their life and ruined his own. Plaxico Burress. When self-defense becomes self-destruction. Moving from accidental death to self-inflicted wounds, Plaxico Burress' story shows how even NFL superstars aren't immune to the consequences of illegal weapons possession. While Burress was primarily a football player, his case became a landmark example of how professional athletes' legal troubles can destroy careers at their peak. On November 29, 2008, Burress was at a Manhattan nightclub when the Glock pistol he was carrying in his sweatpants accidentally discharged, shooting him in the right thigh. The incident occurred during the Giants' Super Bowl winning season, when Burress was one of the most recognizable athletes in America. Instead of a celebration, the night became the beginning of his downfall. New York's strict gun laws meant that carrying an unlicensed firearm was a serious felony, regardless of whether you're a celebrity or not. Burress didn't have a permit to carry the weapon in New York, and his attempts to handle the situation quietly only made things worse. The hospital was required to report gunshot wounds to police, and once the investigation began, there was no hiding what had happened. The legal system moved swiftly. Burress was charged with criminal possession of a weapon and reckless endangerment. Despite his status as a Super Bowl hero, he was sentenced to 2 years in prison and served 20 months before being released. The Giants released him immediately, and his NFL career never fully recovered. What makes Burress' case particularly frustrating is how preventable it was. He carried the gun because he felt unsafe in certain situations, but his illegal method of protecting himself ended up destroying the very career he was trying to protect. The irony is devastating. In trying to secure his safety, he guaranteed his downfall. Ron Artest, Meta World Peace. When on-court violence crosses legal lines. The transition from weapons charges to violent behavior brings us to Ron Artest, whose involvement in the infamous Malice at the Palace brawl led to criminal charges that could have sent him to prison. While Artest didn't serve significant prison time, his case demonstrates how on-court violence can quickly escalate into serious legal consequences. On November 19, 2004, what started as a typical hard foul between Artest and Ben Wallace escalated into the worst brawl in NBA history. When a fan threw a drink at Artest while he was lying on the scorer's table, Artest charged into the stands and began fighting spectators. The melee that followed involved multiple players and dozens of fans, creating chaos that required police intervention to control. The legal fallout was swift and severe. Artest was charged with assault and battery, along with several teammates including Steven Jackson and Jermaine O'Neal. While most of the players received probation and community service, they all faced the real possibility of prison time for their actions during the brawl. Artest ultimately pleaded no contest to assault and battery charges and was sentenced to 1 year of probation, 60 hours of community service, and anger management counseling. He avoided prison, but the incident cost him millions in lost salary due to his 86-game suspension and permanently damaged his reputation. The case established important precedents about athlete accountability. Just because violence occurs during a sporting event doesn't mean it's exempt from criminal prosecution. When athletes cross the line from competitive play to criminal assault, they face the same legal consequences as anyone else. Gilbert Arenas. When locker room pranks become federal cases. From crowd violence to workplace incidents, Gilbert Arenas' gun case shows how even pranks can become serious federal crimes when they involve weapons and threats. Arenas was one of the NBA's brightest stars, known for his clutch shooting and playful personality, but his poor judgment about firearms ended his career and nearly sent him to federal prison. The incident began as a dispute over a gambling debt from a card game on the team plane. Arenas and teammate Javaris Crittenton had been arguing about money, and the situation escalated when both players brought guns to the locker room at the Verizon Center in Washington, D.C. What Arenas claimed was meant as a joke, leaving unloaded guns in Crittenton's locker with a note, became a federal case because it occurred on federal property. The legal implications were staggering. Bringing weapons onto federal property carries serious penalties, and the threatening nature of the incident elevated the charges significantly. Arenas was facing up to 5 years in federal prison for gun charges, plus additional time for making threats in a federal building. Arenas eventually pleaded guilty to carrying a pistol without a license and was sentenced to 30 days in a halfway house, 2 years of probation, and 400 hours of community service. He avoided prison, but the NBA suspended him indefinitely, effectively ending his career at age 27 when he was still one of the league's most talented players. The case destroyed 2 careers simultaneously. Crittenton later faced murder charges in an unrelated case, while Arenas never regained his form after the suspension. What started as a stupid prank between teammates became a federal case that ruined multiple lives. Sebastian Telfair, when street loyalty becomes criminal enterprise. The progression from workplace incidents to street crime brings us to Sebastian Telfair, whose loyalty to his Brooklyn neighborhood led him into a criminal enterprise that resulted in serious prison time. Telfair's case shows how players who maintain connections to dangerous environments can find themselves facing charges that have nothing to do with basketball. Telfair was arrested in 2017 as part of a federal investigation into a large-scale drug and weapons trafficking operation in Brooklyn. The charges allege that Telfair was involved in distributing cocaine, heroin, and firearms as part of an organized criminal enterprise. These weren't minor possession charges. The federal government was alleging that Telfair was an active participant in serious drug trafficking. The evidence against Telfair was substantial. Federal agents had been conducting surveillance and wiretaps for months, gathering evidence of his involvement in the criminal organization. The charges carried potential sentences of 15 to 20 years in federal prison, meaning Telfair was facing the possibility of spending most of his remaining adult life behind bars. In 2019, Telfair pleaded guilty to firearms possession and was sentenced to 3.5 years in federal prison. He served approximately 2 years before being released, but the conviction effectively ended any possibility of returning to professional basketball and severely limited his future opportunities. Telfair's case illustrates the danger of maintaining connections to criminal enterprises even after achieving success. His loyalty to his neighborhood and old friends ultimately cost him his freedom and his future, showing how difficult it can be for some players to completely separate from their past environments. Javaris Crittenton, when bad decisions escalate to murder. Moving from drug trafficking to the ultimate crime, Javaris Crittenton's story represents the most tragic fall from NBA success to life in prison. Crittenton went from being Gilbert Arenas' teammate in the gun incident to being convicted of murder, showing how quickly poor decision-making can escalate to irreversible consequences. After the gun incident with Arenas effectively ended his NBA career, Crittenton returned to his hometown of Atlanta, where he became involved in street life and gang activity. On August 19, 2011, Crittenton was allegedly seeking revenge against someone who had robbed him when he opened fire on a group of people, killing 22-year-old mother Julian Jones, who was walking with her children. The murder charges against Crittenton were devastating. He was accused of multiple felonies, including murder, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and participation in criminal street gang activity. The evidence suggested that Jones was an innocent victim caught in the crossfire of Crittenton's attempt to retaliate against someone else entirely. Crittenton initially fled to Los Angeles, where he was arrested by federal agents and extradited back to Georgia to face the charges. In 2015, he pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and was sentenced to 23 years in prison. He won't be eligible for parole until 2027, meaning he'll spend most of his adult life behind bars for a crime that destroyed multiple families. The tragedy of Crittenton's case extends beyond just his own life. Julian Jones was a young mother whose children lost their parent because of Crittenton's decision to seek street justice, instead of letting legal authorities handle his robbery case. case. His choice to resolve conflicts through violence didn't just end his own future, it destroyed an innocent family. Marcus Camby. When tax evasion becomes criminal. Shifting from violent crimes to white-collar offenses, Marcus Camby's tax evasion case shows how even financial crimes can lead to prison time for NBA players. While Camby's case might seem less dramatic than murder or assault charges, tax evasion is a serious federal crime that the government prosecutes aggressively, regardless of the defendant's celebrity status. Camby was charged with failing to report over $3.3 million in income between 2000 and 2004, resulting in unpaid taxes of approximately $1.1 million. The charges allege that Camby deliberately concealed income from various sources and filed false tax returns that significantly understated his actual earnings during some of his most successful NBA seasons. Federal tax evasion cases are particularly serious because they involve deliberate deception of the government rather than simple mistakes or oversights. The prosecution had to prove that Camby intentionally underreported his income and knew that his tax returns were false when he filed them. In 2010, Camby pleaded guilty to tax evasion charges and was sentenced to 1 day in prison, time served, plus 3 years of probation and substantial financial penalties including restitution, interest, and fines totaling over $2 million. While he avoided significant prison time, the conviction created a permanent criminal record and damaged his reputation. Camby's case demonstrates that white-collar crimes carry real consequences even for wealthy athletes. The federal government takes tax evasion seriously because it undermines the entire tax system, and celebrities receive no special treatment when they're caught deliberately cheating on their taxes. Antoine Walker. When gambling debts become check fraud. Before we examine the most violent cases, Antoine Walker's descent into check fraud shows how gambling addictions can push even millionaire athletes into desperate criminal behavior. Walker earned over $100 million during his NBA career, but his compulsive gambling created financial pressures that led him to commit crimes he never imagined he'd need to consider. Walker's gambling problem was legendary even among NBA players known for high-stakes betting. He would routinely lose hundreds of thousands of dollars in single casino sessions, often betting amounts that exceeded most people's annual salaries. The psychological addiction was so severe that Walker continued gambling even after losing his entire fortune, creating debts that forced him into increasingly desperate situations. In 2009, Walker was arrested in Nevada for writing $1 million in bad checks to Las Vegas casinos. The charges alleged that Walker knew his bank accounts couldn't cover the checks when he wrote them, making this deliberate fraud rather than simple financial mismanagement. Nevada prosecutors take casino fraud seriously because the gambling industry is crucial to the state's economy. The legal consequences were severe. Walker faced multiple felony counts of passing bad checks, each carrying potential prison sentences of several years. The total amount involved, over $1 million, elevated the charges to the most serious category of check fraud, putting Walker at risk of spending years in state prison. Walker ultimately avoided prison by pleading guilty to 3 felony counts and agreeing to pay full restitution to the casinos. He was sentenced to 5 years of probation and 750 hours of community service, narrowly avoiding a prison sentence that could have lasted several years, but the conviction created a permanent felony record that limited his future opportunities. The most tragic aspect of Walker's case is how his gambling addiction destroyed not just his own wealth, but his family's financial security. His wife and children went from living in luxury to facing bankruptcy because Walker couldn't control his compulsive need to gamble. The check fraud charges were just the final chapter in a long story of addiction-driven financial destruction. Lorenzen Wright when personal life becomes murder conspiracy. Moving from financial crimes to the ultimate tragedy, Lorenzen Wright's murder case involves an NBA player as victim rather than perpetrator, but the criminal conspiracy that led to his death included people in his inner circle and reveals how personal relationships can turn deadly when money and custody disputes escalate beyond control. Wright was a respected NBA center who played for multiple teams during his 13-year career, earning over $55 million in salary. After retiring from basketball, Wright returned to Memphis, where he became involved in a bitter custody and financial dispute with his ex-wife, Shara Wright Robinson. What seemed like a typical divorce conflict eventually escalated into a murder conspiracy that shocked the basketball world. On July 19, 2010, Wright's body was found in a wooded area outside Memphis, showing clear signs of execution-style murder. The investigation revealed that Wright had been lured to the location by people he trusted, then killed in what appeared to be a planned assassination rather than a random crime or robbery gone wrong. The criminal case that followed exposed a complex conspiracy involving multiple defendants. Shara Wright Robinson was eventually arrested and charged with first-degree murder, along with Billy Ray Turner, who prosecutors alleged was hired to carry out the killing. The motive appeared to be a combination of insurance money and the desire to resolve their ongoing custody and financial disputes permanently. In 2019, Wright Robinson pleaded guilty to facilitation of first-degree murder and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Turner was convicted of first-degree murder and received a life sentence. The case revealed how domestic disputes can escalate into criminal conspiracies when the financial stakes are high enough and the emotional conflicts run deep enough. Wright's murder case demonstrates that NBA players can become victims of serious crimes committed by people in their inner circles. The wealth and celebrity status that's supposed to provide security can actually make players targets for people willing to commit murder for financial gain or to resolve personal conflicts. DeShawn Stevenson, when investment fraud meets celebrity status. The transition from murder cases to investment fraud brings us to DeShawn Stevenson, whose involvement in a real estate Ponzi scheme shows how NBA players can become both victims and unwitting participants in complex financial crimes. Stevenson's case illustrates how the combination of wealth, poor financial education, and unscrupulous advisors can lead to criminal charges even when the player believes they're making legitimate investments. Stevenson was approached by financial advisors who convinced him to invest millions in what they claimed were lucrative real estate developments. The advisors used Stevenson's celebrity status and visible wealth to attract other investors, essentially turning him into the face of what prosecutors later determined was a massive Ponzi scheme designed to defraud investors of over $20 million. The criminal charges against Stevenson allege that he knowingly participated in the scheme by recruiting other investors and making false statements about the investment opportunities. Prosecutors argued that Stevenson's celebrity status was crucial to the scheme's success because other investors trusted him and assumed his involvement meant the investments were legitimate. The legal complexity of investment fraud cases makes them particularly dangerous for athletes. Proving intent is often difficult, but prosecutors can charge conspiracy and fraud based on actions and statements rather than just direct evidence of criminal intent. Players who think they're making legitimate investments can find themselves facing serious federal charges if the investment turns out to be fraudulent. Stevenson ultimately avoided prison by cooperating with federal investigators and helping them understand how the scheme operated. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges and received probation plus substantial financial penalties. However, the case destroyed his reputation and created lasting legal and financial problems that extended far beyond his basketball career. The most troubling aspect of Stevenson's case is how his celebrity status was weaponized by criminals who used his reputation to defraud other victims. Players who lend their names or images to investment opportunities face significant legal risks if those investments turn out to be fraudulent, regardless of their personal knowledge or intent. Kermit Washington, when a punch changes everything. The transition from financial fraud to physical violence brings us to one of the most infamous incidents in NBA history. Kermit Washington's devastating punch that nearly killed Rudy Tomjanovich and led to criminal charges that could have resulted in prison time. While Washington didn't ultimately serve significant time, his case established important precedents about criminal liability for on-court violence. On December 9th, 1977, during a fight between the Lakers and Rockets, Washington threw a punch that shattered Tomjanovich's face, causing life-threatening injuries including a fractured skull, broken nose, and separated facial bones. The punch was so devastating that Tomjanovich nearly died from his injuries and required multiple surgeries to reconstruct his face. The medical details of Tomjanovich's injuries were horrifying. Doctors described his facial fractures as similar to those seen in high-speed car accidents. His skull was separated from his facial bones, cerebrospinal fluid was leaking from his brain, and he came within minutes of dying from his injuries. The punch literally changed the structure of Tomjanovich's face permanently. The legal implications were immediate and serious. Los Angeles prosecutors considered filing felony assault charges against Washington, arguing that the severity of the punch and the resulting injuries went far beyond acceptable basketball contact. The case raised fundamental questions about where to draw the line between sports competition and criminal assault. Washington was ultimately charged with misdemeanor assault rather than felony charges, and he avoided prison time through a plea agreement that included probation and community service. However, the incident effectively ended his NBA career and led to a $2 million civil lawsuit that Tomjanovich won against Washington. The psychological impact on both players was severe and lasting. Washington struggled with guilt and depression for years after the incident, while Tomjanovich suffered from chronic pain and neurological problems that affected him for the rest of his life. The punch destroyed 2 careers and changed both men's lives permanently. The case established that athletes aren't immune from criminal prosecution for actions that occur during games. When sports violence crosses the line into criminal assault, players can face the same legal consequences as anyone else who commits violent crimes. The precedent set by Washington's case influenced how prosecutors handle sports violence cases to this day. Richard Duma. When drug addiction becomes criminal enterprise. Moving from isolated violent incidents to ongoing criminal behavior, Richard Dumas' story shows how drug addiction can transform talented athletes into career criminals who repeatedly face prison time for drug-related offenses. Dumas was a talented player whose addiction problems led to multiple arrests and prison sentences throughout and after his basketball career. Dumas' first major legal trouble came during his playing career when he was arrested for drug possession and distribution charges in Phoenix. The charges alleged that Duma was not just using drugs recreationally, but was actively involved in distributing controlled substances, making him part of the criminal drug trade rather than just an addicted user. The criminal pattern that emerged showed how addiction can escalate into more serious criminal behavior. What started as personal drug use evolved into distribution charges as Dumas became involved with drug dealers and criminal organizations. His celebrity status made him both a valuable customer and a useful criminal asset for people involved in drug trafficking. Dumas served multiple prison sentences for drug-related charges, including a significant sentence in Arizona State Prison for drug distribution. Each arrest and conviction made it harder for him to maintain his basketball career, creating a downward spiral where legal problems destroyed his earning potential, which increased his involvement in criminal activity to support his addiction. The most tragic aspect of Dumas' case is how his talent was completely wasted due to his addiction and criminal behavior. He had the skills to play in the NBA for many years and earn millions of dollars, but his drug addiction led him into a pattern of criminal behavior that made it impossible to maintain a professional career. Dumas' story illustrates how addiction can transform successful people into career criminals. The same personality traits that made him a successful athlete, risk-taking, competitiveness, and intensity, became dangerous when channeled into criminal activity. His repeated prison sentences show how difficult it is to break the cycle of addiction and criminal behavior once it becomes established. Reggie Williams. When financial desperation leads to robbery. The progression from drug crimes to property crimes brings us to Reggie Williams, whose financial problems after his basketball career led him to commit armed robbery, showing how former NBA players can fall into desperate criminal behavior when their post-career financial planning fails catastrophically. Williams played several seasons in the NBA and earned substantial money during his career, but poor financial management and failed investments left him facing serious financial problems after retirement. Unlike players who lost money to advisors or gambling, Williams simply spent beyond his means and failed to save enough money to maintain his lifestyle after his playing career ended. The financial pressure became overwhelming when Williams faced mounting debts and had no realistic way to generate the income needed to pay his obligations. In a moment of desperation, Williams decided to rob a bank in Memphis, believing he could solve his financial problems through criminal activity rather than accepting a reduced lifestyle or declaring bankruptcy. The robbery was poorly planned and executed, showing how desperation can lead to irrational decision-making. Williams entered the bank with a gun and demanded money, but he made no attempt to disguise himself or plan an escape route. Bank surveillance cameras captured clear images of his face, making identification and arrest inevitable. The legal consequences were severe. Bank robbery is a federal crime that carries mandatory minimum sentences, meaning Williams faced at least several years in federal prison, regardless of the amount stolen or whether anyone was injured. Federal judges have limited discretion in bank robbery cases, making prison time virtually guaranteed. Williams was convicted of armed bank robbery and sentenced to several years in federal prison. The amount he stole, approximately $4,000, was far less than the cost of his legal defense and represented only a tiny fraction of what he had earned during his playing career. The risk-reward calculation was completely irrational, showing how financial desperation can destroy sound judgment. The case demonstrates how former athletes can fall into criminal behavior when they fail to plan adequately for life after sports. Williams had earned enough money during his career to live comfortably for the rest of his life if he had managed it properly, but his poor financial decisions created desperation that led to criminal behavior and prison time. Conclusion: when success isn't enough to avoid consequences, The common thread connecting every NBA player who went to prison isn't poverty, lack of education, or limited opportunities. It's the assumption that success and wealth provide immunity from consequences. These players had achieved the American dream, earning millions of dollars playing a game they loved, but they discovered that money and fame don't exempt anyone from the legal system. What makes these cases particularly tragic is how preventable they were. Jason Williams didn't need to show off weapons to impress friends. Plaxico Burress could have hired security instead of carrying an illegal gun. Gilbert Arenas didn't need to bring firearms to resolve a gambling dispute. Every one of these situations could have been avoided with better decision making. The legal system treats professional athletes like everyone else when they commit crimes. Judges and juries aren't impressed by basketball achievements when they're evaluating criminal behavior. If anything, the high-profile nature of these cases often results in harsher treatment because prosecutors want to demonstrate that celebrities don't receive special treatment. For current NBA players, these cases provide crucial lessons about decision-making and consequences. The same competitive drive and confidence that makes players successful on the court can become dangerous when applied to illegal activities. Players who think they can beat the system the same way they beat opposing teams often discover that the legal system has different rules and much higher stakes. The most successful NBA players understand that their careers and freedom depend on more than just basketball skills. They surround themselves with good advisors, avoid dangerous situations, and understand that one bad decision can destroy everything they've worked to achieve. The players who went to prison all had the talent and resources to avoid criminal behavior. They just made different choices. These stories aren't meant to shame or embarrass former players, but to illustrate how quickly success can turn into tragedy when people make poor decisions. Every player who went to prison was once someone's hero, someone's role model, someone's inspiration. Their falls from grace remind us that success requires more than talent. It requires wisdom, discipline, and the ability to think beyond the immediate moment. The NBA provides incredible opportunities for young men to achieve wealth and fame, but it doesn't provide immunity from consequences. Players who understand this lesson can enjoy long, successful careers both on and off the court. Players who don't often become cautionary tales about how even millionaires aren't above the law.